What is up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Sunday Slaughter podcast. And today I have with me my co-host, Charles, and we have Max as well. And then a very special guest, we have Brett. Brett, why don't you go ahead and chime in here, just introduce yourself. I mean, you probably don't need an introduction, but you might as well.
Don't flatter me, okay? The rule in the guild is that everybody's supposed to be mean to me, and that's definitely a rule that everyone should follow. So don't ever give me an easy time. But no, I am very happy to be here, and it's always really, really fun and exciting to talk about some of this 1.7 stuff. Obviously, the cat's out of the bag that I know a lot of things. I'm not going to give any spoilers away because I don't want to be fired, but it is still very fun, and it's almost like satisfying to hear the community buzzing about this stuff and being really excited, because I think it's a lot of stuff to be excited about, and I'm excited myself. I sit on the edge of my seat every week and wait for these visions to come out, because I just can't wait to jump into that conversation and start talking to you guys about something new and hear how you guys plan to use these new toys, because it's like a brave new world, I think, and I'm super excited to see how it unfolds.
Okay, so I'll tell you what. If we start speculating and let's say we start treading into territory that we may be right, just start breathing really hard into your microphone as a signal that we're pretty close to some spoilers and stuff like that.
I don't know how Simon would view that, but it would be interesting if you did guess something exactly right. But I think Michael and Fabio did such a good job with this stuff that when it comes out, it's so unexpected. Like, I don't think anybody saw Jojen coming out and being that good. And like everything that they've shown, everybody's like thinking that it's so good. And for me, that's like a win for the design team, because it's like people are mentally creating, and it's like, well, I have to have this guy and I have to have this guy, but like you're out of points, so it's not going to work. You're going to have to make a bunch more different lists and try stuff out. So,
well, before we get started, I'll just go ahead and tell our audience here what we have in store for this episode. So we will be sort of digesting the 1.7 changes that have come out in the past few weeks, specifically how some of these changes will affect the factions that we main, what other changes we would like to see, and then each of us will name one thing in 1.7 that you suspect is a catalyst for other changes that will be coming down the line. And then after that, we're going to talk about some things regarding 1.6, sort of as like a farewell to what we're leaving behind. So we're going to talk about a commander or unit that we would have liked to experiment with more. Is there anything that we'll miss in particular? And we'll also talk about this. This is a very important topic I think we should talk about is, some players mention stagnation within their local meta. So what are some things that people can do to revitalize things within their local scene to sort of keep the spirit alive? So let's just get right into it. Max, we'll start off with you. You obviously are a staunch supporter of Baratheons. And ironically, I think that faction may have the least amount spoiled. So maybe we can talk about some of the stuff that you've seen and how that sort of affects how you're going to be playing Baratheons, or what you suspect to be changing within that faction.
Sure. So, spoiler alert for the coming battle report, I use the old Stag Knights, and they are not awesome, other than their sculpt looking super cool. So the new Stag Knights look just fantastic. And actually, in a game mode, like the new Clash of Kings, where you could use them as a bunker for your commander, and that commander's unit can keep coming back. And in the later rounds, that unit becomes more and more devastating. I could see that really having a spot. I actually am just excited because in most game modes, you want to keep your commander alive as long as possible. I'm actually notorious for dropping a Baratheon commander in ranged units, because I like keeping my commander alive, and I like having the option of putting him on a back note if I need to and stuff like that. But I'm excited to have a more thematic unit to put them in other than Bastards Girls. So
Right.
I'm excited to have that unit that justifies me keeping them alive and just gets stronger and stronger as the game goes on. So all of a sudden your opponent starts to sweat if they haven't dropped that commander unit earlier in the game, and they realize, like, boy, if I engage that unit turn 4, turn 5, I've got a huge problem on my hands, especially because it would appear that the changes to the coming game aren't going to have as much of that one-shot ability, to make up a word there. So that's I'm excited for that too. That you have this unit that's meant to live longer, and then on top of it, the game just appears like things are going to live longer. So you'll have an opportunity to use those things. In the current rendition of Stag Knights, basically your job is to roll them up with Last Stand in your hand. Hope your opponent doesn't have Counterplot or Tyrion or something like that. Let them get killed, and then Last Stand all over the place and hope they just one shot. So, which Charles just alluded to in our chat. So you get one shot, and then you return the one shot with your Last Stand. But yeah, I think that's the thing of the different spoilers that I'm most excited about. I'm excited to see Sentinels have a place. I think that's pretty neat. The changing things to a 4-up on hit will be kind of interesting. But I do like their ability, that Sentinel ability, where they have the same thing that the solo Dragonstone Noble does, where you're or Lord Dragonstone, where when one of your units gets attacked, you can either make a free counter charge, or you get to make a free maneuver, as long as you're within long range. So that seems like that's going to create a lot of tactical flexibility and provide some mobility that, to this point, Baratheons have none of. So that is really, really exciting for me. The tactics card they spoiled looked so similar to every other tactics card that Baratheons have that it's tough to say if they're doing anything, in a different direction for that. It almost looked like it wasn't going to have the trigger of requiring to be engaged, but then it still had the trigger of having to be engaged. So
real quick, Sustained Assault is the card that you're referring to, and it says when a friendly unit is performing a melee attack before rolling attack dice, if this unit began the turn engaged with a defender, it rolls its highest attack die value. If the defender has more remaining ranks than the attacker, the defender becomes vulnerable. To your point of the Sentinels being stronger than they were in 1.6, I'm going to bring up one of the Visions of the Flames. I forget which one it is. The one where they talk about faction identities and cards. So there was a point that was made that they are changing decks that have cards that give free activations. So obviously cards like Swift Advance or Sudden Charge. But now we're seeing a unit like the Sentinels get abilities that give actions like that. I'm suspecting maybe Baratheons, they become that faction, that strike back faction with units that provide free charges or free attacks.
Yeah, I'd like to see it more out of the unit or the attachment and less out of the tactics deck. And we talked about this last week, that when the tactics deck is too strong, it limits what you're allowed to do with the units. But if you compare it on the tactics deck, then the units themselves can be really exciting to field and fill their own specific roles on the battlefield, which is pretty exciting.
Hopefully we'll see more of that. Let's give a second for Brett to breathe heavily if we're on the marker now.
Well, the exception to the rule that you just mentioned is of course the Starks. The Starks get the funnest and the coolest, just bang for their buck point value units, and they get a tactics deck that is just plain gas. So like a lot of the Stark units in any other faction would be, oh my god, what would Baratheons do with great axes? They would be so happy.
I was thinking that too.
To Mickey at Link today, and he's like, well, great axes are the outlier in the Starks, but give Baratheons great axes and they would be elated. Like we get stronger when we're in combat. That's what we do. We would love great axes. And Starks have them, and they're like, it's okay. We have berserkers. We don't need these guys. But no, I think it's a good point. I think that Fabio actually mentioned that when they were designing the Baratheon deck, which Fabio had a big hand in designing the Baratheons, they made that deck so powerful that the feeling for them was, well, we can't really make these units too good, because this deck is just so strong. It's got so many out of turn attack. You've got Hold the Line adding attack dice. Last Stand is kind of a game winning card. If it's late in the round and the unit is near death and it dies from attacking you, it might be just what you needed to win the game. So it's an interesting point that Max says maybe making the unit stronger and toning some decks down might be a really cool way to make some of these factions have that identity.
So, okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a sort of a subject of contention. Are you referring to the Baratheon 1.6 deck as strong?
Yes, the 1.6 deck, if you look at it in a vacuum, right? If you just look at the deck, like think back, I don't know if you guys were playing the game, but when the Baratheon deck was spoiled, the full deck, it was like, man, it's got a commander card from the Stark deck. It's got Last Stand, which is a great John card. It's got an Assault Veteran's ability with Hold the Line. It's got 2 out of turn attack cards that are just straight up attacks. And Stag's Resilience obviously is just an amazing card all the way around. Maybe Stag's Wit and Baratheon Conviction aren't great, but I'm sure Max can attest as playing Baratheons. It's generally the Ours is the Fury, Countercharge, Stag's Resilience, and like Last Stand are really the gas that drives that deck. There's one more card. Oh, I said Hold the Line. So yeah, the issue is that they have overlapping triggers, but Fabio had mentioned that he kind of did that because those cards are so powerful. Stag's Resilience is a game-changing card. It's literally potentially an 8-wound swing at activation. If you kill them with Stag's Resilience, you're able to then do another action, a march, a maneuver, a different charge. So it is a powerful deck. It just seems a little bit less powerful because in practice, Wardens are slow and they're defensive, but they're not really super punchy. And then kind of across the board, you've got these solid-ish infantry units. So it was something that, Fabio mentioned. It was something that maybe he didn't come out and say that it was a mistake, but that was the design intent. This deck has the potential to be really, really powerful. So we have to tread carefully with this. So they gave them all those overlappers.
Yeah, so what Fabio said in that interview was actually that when they were making the Baratheon deck, they realized that the game was going in a direction they didn't like, and that to keep the Baratheon deck on pace with things like the Starks deck, they had to only option they felt they had was to pack in more and more free actions. So they realized there was power creep in the tactics decks. I think what some of the Baratheon players, I'm gonna stick up for y'all a little bit here, are feeling is not just the conflicting triggers, or stack triggers. It's the double tap, right? So when you go through final testing, and beta testers is why I defend a lot of you guys, is that you get one version of the rules, and another group often gets another group of the rules, or final changes are made after internal testing, after your feedback is turned in. So you don't actually see the final version of most things. So you see this kind of design space where you get one recommended adjustment, and that seems cool. And then you get another recommended adjustment that kind of goes with it, but you end up with a double tap. And I think Baratheons in the starter box specifically got like almost triple tapped because they got 2 different faction identities as the only real like nested subfaction in a box that exists. Loyalties. Then they got we're kind of power creeping on the tactics deck, so let's kind of make them pick which version of which action they get. Don't let them all stack, which is probably really smart. Followed by, but also these are a lot of free things, so let's tone down some of these units. Well, then you end up with this really vanilla baseline of half my hand is kind of useless, my units aren't great, and I can only play half my models. Rip. Welcome to playing Baratheons. And I don't think that was Fabio's intentions, right? He had the best of intentions, and I think he was right in recognizing that early that there was power creep in the tactics decks. And unfortunately, some of this is fall defeat of early design, and you look at like the Starks deck. So that's all fine and good. But yeah, I do think that, and I do think the Baratheons probably, had they not made those changes, would have had the strongest deck in the game. And it ended up actually being one of the most balanced decks in the game, and that's why it feels bad. because other factions just got their hall pass, being the wave 1 and wave 2 factions. That when you got to wave 3 factions, that actually they understood what healthy game design was going to be in the realm of tactics decks. They were the first to get that. So they kind of started with a quote unquote nerf bat, unfortunately, because they were from lessons learned. And that's actually what leads to these types of big rebalancing. For people who are new to wargaming, this always happens, right? You know, you got the oldest child, the firstborn, and everything's great and it's beautiful and it's lovely and we're all happy to have a kid. Then the second sibling comes and things are still magical and fun because now they can play together and have a good time. And on the third one, it's just really controlled. You realize that, like, most of these things don't matter. It's real streamlined. It's really efficient. It's what we know what's going on. And then you get the balance faction on the third round. And now, as what we're seeing, you have to go back and you have to throttle things like Free Folk and Starks and things that obviously had power creep to answer each other that really hurt everyone else, and created this really unhealthy design space. So we're actually really on time with Song of Ice and Fire, honestly, in the life cycle of a war game. And I think Baratheons and some of these rebalances we're seeing for Baratheons are actually one of the most telling signs that the game is going to go in the right direction. Because Baratheons have topped in some events, despite having that being one of the first really handicapped factions of by balance. And then on top of that, they're going to get tuned up and everything else is going to get leveled out as well. So I just kind of want to add to that what Brett was saying, add a little extra context there.
So, Brett, whether or not you can answer this, do you suspect, when they were tooling each deck, were they taking what they would think was the strongest deck and then bringing everyone up to that? How do you think they would have went about sort of balancing each faction's deck?
Okay, so that's a question I can kind of try to answer, but basically it's their design, and then we just kind of test it, and we can give some feedback on how we feel about it. But what I gathered from the testing is that they just kind of took what they had learned from the game, right? Because now they have a lot more data. They have a lot more tournament data, and they've got a lot of player feedback. Because, again, I'm going to reiterate something that I say a lot in podcasts. The developers, they really do pay attention to the community. They do lurk. They do hear what people are saying. They hear your complaints. Maybe they're not going to address every single complaint right away. Maybe every single time somebody's asking for an FAQ, they're not rushing out to release that FAQ right now, but they are paying attention. And I think they've learned a lot, just as we as players have learned a lot throughout the course of this game. So I think they went into it with a kind of not necessarily a fresh start kind of thing, but I think they had a very good idea of what they were doing. And I think everybody is going to be pretty impressed and pretty happy with the end result. I'm very confident in saying that it'll be the best version.
On to Charles, and Max can chime in here because I know that he plays Free Folk as well. What do you see within the changes in 1.7 and how that affects, how you will end up playing Free Folk?
Well, for one, we're going to play an activation down from where we normally are. Most of the game is going to come down one activation roughly. I think not entirely. I think the games we played are on an average of about 7.5 activations, and that's just due to how units shake out with the new full point NCUs. A lot of people are already paying 11-ish points. Going to that 12th point is not a deal breaker, but it's going to cut down 1 unit, or at least from a 6-point unit to a 5-point unit. But we see the point cost change in Raiders means you're going to get 3 Raiders for 12 points instead of 4, which is a big deal. 12 bodies, no matter what their quality is a big deal, which I do think is probably healthy for the game. I have some concerns about some of the things with Raiders and how they're going to play and things like that, but some of that is also personal preference and really just kind of based on how the game is played now. I don't really know what it's going to look like in the big picture. We're really not going to know as Free Folk players what we're going to play like until we actually see another unit. We have not seen any solos. We have not seen any commanders. We have not seen anything but one attachment and one NCU, really. We've now seen 2 attachments. We've seen Weeper, but like Baratheons, we're on the low end of reveals at the moment. And it's really going to come down to what our actual unit quality looks like at the moment. So We're gonna have to see what comes up soon. But some obvious things we're gonna have to answer is Raiders don't have the staying power they used to have for insignificant. So is insignificant gonna be viable? Do trappers stay the same? Is a big question we're gonna need to answer. But honestly, I'm a little less concerned with that than I am to see an example of what like spear wives could look like, or what thins could look like, or what followers of bone can look like. Because if you're eliminating some of the insignificant options as bubble wrap for our commanders or objective holders, then those other units are going to have to be good by themselves in a vacuum on the table and be like, yes, I'd run that in any faction at 6 points. It is just a solid unit for 6 points. And at the moment, we don't really have any units like that as they exist. So they're going to all need to be polished up to be like 6 points, sure. I think probably the closest thing to that is probably Spear Wives, where you'd say at 4 points, worth a point, I'll take Spear Wives, no problem. But then that makes Trappers pretty much obsolete if you say that your baseline is a 4-point unit of Spear Wives. So we really need to see some units for Free Folk to really understand honestly where they're going to be. So that's really it for me at the moment for Free Folk. There's some other general game design frame that I think I'm gonna have to keep in mind as a competitive player, but I think we're gonna address that a little bit later in this episode.
So Max, maybe you can give your opinion about a thought that I just had, is thinking about the free folk in a particular design space. So you have the other factions where you can go on either side of the spectrum and have a certain play style, whether if what you want to be a little more control, or if you want to be aggressive, like Lannisters can be aggressive with a commander like Gregor. But with free folk, they have a defined play style, with it being a horde army that doesn't really hit hard but can overwhelm you. Is that sort of like a weird place to be when you're trying to think about how you would design that yourself?
So I think that insignificant, when we first saw Free Folk, when they first leaked the units and you're just looking at it on paper, I remember we all thought like, God, this faction looks like crap. And then you played them and realized that insignificant was the single most powerful ability in the game. In my opinion, anyways, I guess it's all opinion. But I think a lot of people would agree having something be insignificant is just incredibly powerful, given that most of the game modes, you're scoring points for killing units. But I think at the same point in time that I kind of expected when we first saw the Raiders and the Trappers and the Giants, I kind of assumed that a lot of their units would carry that same ability and just be slight modifications. Like Spear Wives would be insignificant, but they've got a ranged and a melee attack that's maybe a little more viable, but they're slower than Trappers, so on and so forth. I was kind of surprised that here we are sitting well down the road that there are no other insignificant units in that army. Everyone else is significant. I also think that that's probably their hardest army to balance from a thematic lore standpoint and then to the tabletop, because there are supposed to be just a bajillion of them, right? And
Right.
that just doesn't fit on a 4x4 table to put that many down. I remember when they first showed us the Kickstarter, there was an ability called banding that they were going to have in the game. And it was going to be where two 12-man units clicked together to make a 24-person unit. And it moved as one and it attacked as one and everything. It would have been interesting to see them bring that into the Free Folk, actually, just to implicate, how you're getting swarmed up and whatnot. But I guess they kind of did with the old version of the raid leaders. But yeah, I just think they're really hard to balance because, as you mentioned, their identity is being the horde outnumber army. Although because of the NCUs and dogs and stuff like that, we've seen that in the meta, they don't always tremendously outnumber their opponent, right? I mean, there are plenty of times where they actually don't outnumber their opponent. And it's when they do outnumber their opponents and it's dramatic, it's usually because they're playing against a specific faction that rolls low on the activations. But most people learned about high activation superiority being a huge advantage through the existence of the free folk. So I hope that they still get to maintain that activation superiority, because it's really fun to play with when you are a free folk player. I was definitely stunned to see the way that they adjusted raiders. And we talk about like thematic versus how it works on tabletop, making them cowardly. I know you've read the books and we've talked about it, that just the name of that ability makes me squirm when I think of free folk who climb an 800-foot wall. They hang out with mammoths and dire wolves and giants and white walkers. So to give them an ability called cowardly is kind of tough. Disorganized. It's funny, Charles just mentioned in chat. I was just about to say the same thing. Disorganized would have been such a better term. Maybe they have time to change that. There's a little nugget for you from the slaughterhouse to Simon, just for us lore buffs over here. It would just be nice, because there's a really cool part when Corin is talking to John in one of the chapters, and he talks about how really the only difference between a free folk raider and a watchman and a night's watch is that night's watch are organized and disciplined. And at the time, the free folk weren't, but he was talking about how scary it was that Mance was organizing them. So that Mance organizing them then all of a sudden made them just as scary as a Night's Watch brother. And I just think that it would be cool in so many other ways. The game translates so well to the books or to the show. And then when you look at that, you're like, guys, that faction, I'm sure, is so hard to balance and make work on the tabletop. But that's one that just, I don't know why. Even when I first saw them, I'm like, why do these guys have horrible morale? They should all have 6-up armor saves. They're wearing robes running around. And but why is their morale so bad? And once it was explained to me that morale is an indication of their organization and their bravery, but then I thought, like, well, then berserkers should also be an 8-up, because those guys are just winging around going nuts. But that's 2 cents. Like what you asked about, how it fits in the design space. They do have a very specific faction identity, but I still think within that, their commanders still get to do fun things. Harma's cool with the maneuvering. I like that Weeper is essentially like, so I came from neutrals to free folk to Baratheons. And you can see that because I went from Boltons to Weeper to Stannis loyalty Baratheon. So kind of following that trend.
One of the topics I had in the show notes, and this is before Brett sort of confirmed that he'd be on the show, was each of us was going to name one thing in 1.7 that we suspect is sort of a catalyst for other changes that haven't been confirmed yet. Now that we have Brett on the show, I wanted to maybe just hone in on that and talk about how, a lot of units are sort of getting nerfed in the aspect of not hitting on threes. Certain 5-point units not hitting on threes and maybe losing attack dice. So to me, at face value, that seems like we're going to see a more grindy type game. Brett, what do you think about that?
I think the idea that comes from there is, I don't want to use the term lazy. That's not the fair word. But I think a lot of times when you're listening to some discussions, let's just pick on Lannisters for a minute, because I pick on free folk all the time. In a lot of channels, you have Lannisters saying things like when they released Screamers. And then in a lot of the Lannister channels, the conversation was something like, well, they're really fast and they're really scary, but it's fine because we have Knights of Casterly Rock, we have the High Sparrow, we can bring 4 Knights of Casterly Rock, and we can take them out in one shot. That's fine. We'll kill them. Their mobility is not a problem. So it's not that it's lazy necessarily. I don't know that's the right word, but that seems to be like, obviously you've seen the change to Walder Frey. And that change is kind of in the same line. It's like, okay, this is something that's really good. This is something that's really tactical. And if my opponent uses it right, it's going to give me problems. But if I have Walder Frey, I don't have to worry about it. If I have Knights of Casterly Rock that can wipe Screamers out in one charge, I don't have to worry about getting overwhelmed by Screamers and them doing what they want to do. So the idea there, I think with some units hitting on 4s as opposed to hitting on 3s is this isn't me spoiling anything, they've said it. Overall, they've reduced the amount of damage that units can do because they want you to earn those types of things. They want you to earn the crucial tactics board play that puts you in position to get a charge, maybe a double charge, something of this nature, carefully, maybe even sacrificing the objectives for a time, taking a lower points than your opponent in order to set up that first turn charge. Some of those tactical plays should have a higher impact because it lets you do things later in the round, or that end of round charge into the sword. Something like this, you've earned that, as opposed to, oh, my Sworn brothers have 8 attack dice, they've got 10 attack dice with the Sword in the Darkness. Now I can just go in with 10 attack dice, roll as many 6s as I possibly can, and more than likely, even if it's a 4+ defense or a 3+ defense unit, I can explode it, and then I just don't have to worry about that unit anymore. So as far as the game being more grindy, did they set out to say, well, we want X number of units alive, we don't want any tablings? I don't think that was their intent, but they do want to see some of that one-shot potential and some of this damage reduced.
Yeah, at the moment, I'm going to disagree with that a little bit. They keep saying that, but at the current pace of spoilers, we're not seeing it necessarily. We still see a lot of 3+, roughly at the 7-point threshold and up is the 3+ to hit. And a lot of the things that really abused 3 up to hit were already at 7 points. You look at things like Berserkers, and while they did go up to 4, their new version can go hit on 2s on the last rank. Most things that lost an attack dice on the front end gained it on the back end, which levels out. You see an increase in abilities that increase passive damage as well, with things like Counter Strike on agile models, as well as the more streamlined version of Wildfire on Pyro. You now see additional rerolls and attacks outside of the charge. You also see additional. We now have more models with counter charge built into the orders, for instance. So at the moment, if you actually mathed out all the units, we're almost at a static level of wounds dealt throughout the course of the game. You're just down 1 or 2 wounds from the charge itself, and then after that, it's all pretty much the same. I don't actually think, based on what they've shown so far, which is only maybe 12-15% of the total game, of the game, has been spoiled. So there's a lot left to reveal here. So it's hard to really say if they've delivered on that design metric or not. I think it's a little unfortunate, though, with that being the design philosophy they keep pushing forward, that they haven't actually chosen units that display that yet. And while Panic is nerfed by 1, which is a 25% decrease in cap, an average of about 33% per Panic check, Cowardly does hurt that on the free folk side. But we've also seen an increase so far. It seems to be a pretty big metric of just kind of tacking on that, like, justifiable for a commander, or justifiable for a unit, or justifiable for something else. Addition of a manipulation of Panic. So a lot of times, I think honestly, most of the time, you're going to be sitting at pretty average Panic damage, to be honest. Precision now is basically auto wounds, which means a lot of units, especially with Jaqen going to be neutral NCU, are going to be able to push through no saves. So you're going to be triggering Panic more reliably with units that normally couldn't, which means there's not actually a decrease in auto wounds. It just becomes a bit more random. So some games you'll have an increase in auto wounds. Some cases you'll have a decrease, which means on average you'll probably have about the same. It just will be less predictable, which is actually probably bad for both players, in my opinion. And on top of that, you end up with situations like, where it's impossible to hit in some cases, and you're really relying on Panic even more in lists, like with Lannister Guardsmen. So at the moment, if you actually took all the spoilers given to us, the game is not less killy at all, honestly. But that's purely in a vacuum. That's not taking into account new game modes, new objectives, and a lot of other new things. Terrain is a big thing for me right now in 1.7 that I'm actually really excited about. So I'm still not sold, and not that I'm saying Brett's wrong. I'm saying I know Brett knows more than me, and his friends haven't showed me yet. That's all it really is to it. I need to see the rest of the story, and I think speculation's fun, and I'm cool with it. But at the moment, this game is not less killy.
It's a fair point. You guys, the community as a whole is definitely looking at things in a vacuum. You've just seen a few little tidbits.
Yeah.
You've seen a few pieces. You've seen just a few tactics cards. I would honestly say you've seen less than 15%. But I haven't really calculated that. But I think you've just seen a few little spoilers. So some of the bigger picture is still out there. I think some of the danger with that is, and I'm not saying that you're doing this per se, Charles. It's people in Discord, people on some of the Facebook channels. They're just continuing to work with assumptions that some things still exist. And whether they do or not, they don't know that. So that can be a dangerous game. Don't really want to give any specific examples, but I think it's safe to say when they said that every element of the game was looked at, it's pretty, I mean, that's every element of the game was looked at. So taking some piece and then mixing it with something that exists in 1.6 would be a dangerous game to play.
Yeah, I know, and that's why in most of my examples I've given, I've used all units that are spoiled thus far. You look at things like the Bloody Murmurs with Agile and Counter-Strike. You look at Howland, who gives his ability, which stacks with Agile. You look at Jaime, who's spoiled in the rulebook. All those things are spoiled, right? And then you look at something like the new Stag Knights, which hit on 3s, who actually just get wrecked in the early rounds by those exact units and die at the same pace. You also look at things like units losing a morale because the game, quote unquote, got less killy in some cases. Sentinels got increased by morale, which is good. But you look at things like Zerkers that lost the morale, they're actually going to take more damage overall. You got a couple of cases of that in units that are spoiled that at the moment as they work, with NCUs and attachments that we mentioned that are spoiled with things like precision, things like rerolls to attack, like the watch caption and things like that. These things are all printed in the spoilers. And if you just put lists together with those things, taking tactics cards out of it, obviously, because you don't know the commanders, head up, those things still kill each other roughly the same pace.
With that being said, I do want to be careful because I do not want to put Brett in a situation where
sure.
he starts to slip up. So we'll go ahead and move on from the speculation side of 1.7 and maybe look back on 1.6. One of the things I thought would be fun to talk about, and we'll start with Max. Was there a particular army build or commander that you look back on and say, like, I should have experimented with that more, or I didn't really get a chance to really see what that type of list had to offer?
So, Chris, we were actually talking about this when we were filming the battle report, but of all the different commanders in their respective armies, the one that actually fits how I'd like to play the game the most is the Mountain in the Lannisters. And ironically, I've only played him like once or twice in the entirety that the game's been out. But being able to use the Lannisters' control that's built into their basic tactics deck and some of their units with his just unbridled aggression and the aggression of the units that he likes to bring and the units that he and his brother the Hound like to sit in, that army just seems like a ton of fun to field. And then, of course, we're in a panic meta where, panic can be very strong. So I never really dove too hard into Lannisters because there were definitely, for most of the time that Song's been around in our group, there have been plenty of Lannister players. So I've always tried to play a faction that didn't have a ton of players with it. But the Mountain, from the beginning of the game all the way up until now, is a guy that I look at and just his style is a style after my own heart because you get all of that aggression, but you're not forced to play pure aggression because of that Lannister tactics deck and the fact that you can still take some units with some nice armor and stuff like that to cover your butt if your aggression gets you into some overextension, as opposed to just running like a whole bunch of Berserkers and Great John or something like that. So yeah, that's the one commander I look at that I probably should have played more. I even started painting him and painting some Mountainsmen, but never really put him on the table or anything. So yeah, that's the one that stands out to me when you ask that question.
Yeah, I actually got to experiment a little bit with Gregor. We played in a tournament a few weeks ago, and it was a tournament where everyone was given a random faction, and I had Lannisters. So I was like, you know what? I've always wanted to try out Gregor. We're going to do it. All of his cards seem super powerful, and with with Tyrion NCU being able to have that extra card in your hand, it's like you're more likely to draw into it. I was burned so many times from failed charges with the mountain that I just eventually was like, I can't do it. his play style is so predicated on making that charge and having it not be disordered that I was like, this is too much like playing Targs right now. I give up. I'll turn it over to Brett, and Brett has actually been playing neutrals. I know he's known for playing Lannisters and Night's Watch. Maybe talk about what your experience has been like with playing neutrals and how that's been before these changes come about for 1.7.
Yeah, neutrals, it just seemed like kind of a natural fit because I really enjoyed that Lannister control, like Max said, and some of that relying on panic for damage. I always kind of wanted to tinker around with them, but they jumped out to me as a, like a high skill faction. So when I first got into the game, I didn't get into them. But with that said, I came to appreciate them a lot, honestly, after some of the games that you and I played, and Bill. Bill was a really big part of that as well. Just watching you guys make neutrals work, I was like, I'm going to play neutrals, and I'll probably lose. Maybe not every game, but I'll probably lose. But at the end of the day, I think if I play around with neutrals, it should make me a better player because they're just inherently just not quite as strong as some of these other factions. I really, really, really enjoy playing neutrals. They're a lot of fun. Their deck is absolutely amazing, and it did everything that I was hoping for because when you have a deck like that hinges so strongly on those zones, right? Their cards don't just get better when you control the zone, they just get exponentially better. So it's a really tough balance where you've got to play the board and the tactics board at the same time. You want your cutthroats charging things that haven't activated, but you also want to be able to get the best out of your cards by controlling the letter and the bags. So it's been a really, really fun lesson in trying to balance that. And I had games, I had a lot of success, and then it just seems like when you play them into, I'm sure Chris knows this struggle all too well. Starks, Free Folk, and even Night's Watch to some degree, it's just clap city. You
Oh,
just
God.
get clapped. But I like them so much. I mean, I even played that ranked game against your sausage cannon, and the game was actually pretty close. Change a little bit of bad luck, and it could have been closer than what it was. It wasn't a full total blowout, but it was a really fun game. It's I think about that game, and it's one of the more enjoyable ones that I've had recently because we weren't throwing meta lists into each other, right? So if I could do something, I would probably play with neutrals a little bit more and just try to make them as good as I possibly could.
When Brett refers to sausage cannon, he's referring to a list that I bring to the table. It's Night's Watch with Ramsey and a Scorpion. So for those who are curious, that's what sausage cannon is.
I've been sausage cannoned then. Circa first battle report of Sunday Slaughter.
That's right. To Brett's point about neutrals, it was a faction that I was drawn to early on, and I'm glad that I started with them because the neutral deck and the ability to properly pilot that army takes a knowledge of knowing the other tactics decks and how your opponent is going to react to some of your cards. There's a high ceiling for neutrals, but it was still satisfying. I haven't really played neutrals since I started playing other factions like Starks, Baratheons, pretty much every other faction, but I am very excited for 1.7 neutrals. I think they're going to be very fun, just from what was spoiled so far. So Charles, we'll move on to you, and let's talk about something that maybe you sort of regret not playing as much in 1.6.
So there was a small period of time where I was going to play Starks when I first was looking at the game, only because I was told they had like a real cagey hit and run kind of tempo mid-range style. And my fiance loves anything with cool direwolf models and stuff, so I paint a lot of them as far as like our little personal collection of painted stuff. And I never got to play them because they were Starks, basically. And I was like, you know what? seeing how this kind of curves out, I'm not going to play them. And then my free folk opportunity came up, and I was like, let's do that. Crazy woodsmen of the north, let's go. Let's chase big women and play with giants. Seems like a good time. And so my real regret, honestly, is not getting in enough games with Tormund, who's my favorite free folk character, because he's just hilarious. And he's every guy I ever enjoyed getting drunk with in a bar. And on top of that would be Rattleshirt. Because I kind of like the fact that Free Folk have a commander that is kind of a knockoff of, um, he's kind of the Walmart brand of other factions, right? Harma being your Stark, Rattleshirt being your Night's Watch knockoff, Mance being kind of your Lannister type character, things like that. I really appreciate that about Free Folk a lot. And I'm a little ashamed I haven't really cashed in on the Night's Watch aesthetic of stacking buffs on my units, even though Rattleshirt's kind of bad as a commander, just because the way the rest of the faction is designed around him. But I really, really, really liked that design space because I also liked the Voltroning my units that Night's Watch can do too. And I just didn't play it enough, honestly. Good, bad, or indifferent. It's probably just really fun. I did enjoy it the one time I did it, right? So I would say Rattleshirt's probably my biggest regret.
All right, so this is this next topic here. I think is going to be very important. Hopefully, there's going to be players that get something out of this. People are saying my local meta has just sort of dropped off. Max, what do you think are some things that players can do to sort of revitalize their player base?
Probably bring more sausage cannon.
Yeah, no doubt about that.
But then, other than so outside of that, I think we've been talking about maybe throwing another tournament here before the changes actually hit, and we talked about how really what sparked our group was smaller tournaments or adjusting the way that the tournament's able to be played. It does reduce the competitive nature of the tournament. We certainly understand that. Like, we've run tournaments before where you were only allowed to take neutrals if you were running neutrals. In a 30-point tournament, we ran a tournament like that, and it was kind of cool because it made the neutral players feel special, because they got to bring their toys that no one else actually got to bring. And then you got to see units on the table that you weren't used to seeing because there was a neutral equivalent that maybe served that purpose a little bit better. So we know that that's not competitive. We know that that's not exactly the way CMON intended the game. However, with TTS being available, if you're looking for more of a competitive level of tournament, you can always just hop on TTS and jump into those tournaments and play that way. We're trying to rekindle the fun and the laughter around the table, the social aspect of the gaming. So we're trying. We've been brainstorming. Chris, I know you're a part of that too, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But we're trying to brainstorm ways to actually keep our gamer population involved, because one of the other big challenges that's been created through COVID and some of the struggles with Asmodee and CMON is failure to get new product out. And what I know, at least about gamers, is that gamers love to spend their money on gaming stuff. And if you can't get us new gaming stuff, we will spend our money on a different game. So we're trying to, make sure that we don't lose gamers to other games at the same point in time, because that's a challenge too, because gamers are showing up to a local gaming store, which means Song of Ice and Fire isn't the only thing on the shelf. There's a whole lot of other stuff around. And if the game starts to feel a little bit stale and you haven't gotten any new product, and maybe you're a free folk player that only wants to play free folk and you have everything and it's already all painted and nothing new's come out or something like that, it can be, pretty challenging to keep those players engaged. And again, we're just trying to come up with ways. And I think that doing like low profile tournaments or game days or something like that, creating some prize sport around it, is really important, just to remind people that it's just fun to push miniatures around a table, roll dice, create funny situations. We've got like a guy, Chris, his name's Dave, but his nickname is Steaks on Stakes. because his patented strategy is to run dire wolves over stakes to kill them to trigger North Remember and fight you with it. And it's hilarious to play in because at least 75% of the time it does not work out in his favor. But you laugh your butt off when you play Dave, when you play stakes on stakes. And just reminding people that, you get in games with people like Dave, you just laugh real hard. I mean, you step away from the table, you had fun, your belly hurts, you guys go both talk and tell everybody else at the other tables what you were laughing so hard about in the middle of a tournament. We're trying to get that type of excitement back. And I think, making some loopholes that aren't exactly the way the game is intended is maybe the way to do it. Similar to what you're doing with season 2 of your battle reports, with making the battles more thematic, more based on book fights and stuff like that instead of just meta fights. I think that's also a fun way to do it. I know I've done a Battle of the Bastards game before where I was the Free Folk and I partnered up with, or actually I wasn't, I was the Boltons, partnered up with a Stark player playing Umbers, and we went against a Free Folk player who then had Jon Snow in Free Folk. So he had like Tormund and Jon Snow, and he had Jon Snow commander cards in a Free Folk deck. And it was
That's
really
amazing.
cool. Yeah. It was super fun, actually. It created some really unique situations. You cannot imagine how brutal it is when you pop the Jon Snow card on a giant and you think you dropped him and he hangs out with 1 life and then hits you back into oblivion. So just fun stuff like that,
Yes, the battle reports that we filmed for season 2 were some of the most fun matches I played. I've never laughed harder than I have in any other game. Max and I filmed the season finale. It was part 2 of Blackwater Bay. I'm not going to spoil anything, but it was probably the best ending we could have ever had for season 2. So you guys stay tuned for that. All right, so Charles, you, as I understand it, are located pretty much on the other side of the country. You're down south in the Louisiana area. I don't know what your meta is like, but maybe you can chime in and give your opinions on the topic of revitalizing your scene.
Yeah, so like our scene is actually not that big here for Ice and Fire for Song, but it's been huge for a lot of other games. And like I mentioned earlier, Song is in a transition period that every game has in their life cycle, right? It's like puberty for war games. And we're getting to that first big maturation step of the game itself. So a couple of things you can do, and I think a lot of them have been touched on are really good. Remind people why you play games. Just hang out. Think of alternative formats. Play on TTS. Hit up some of these people on these Discords. It's real easy to use stats to keep track of ELO tournaments, even in store, right? Because it's calculated in the tournament software. It's not a stretch by any means. Sign up for the Slaughterhouse tournament coming up for teams. We're still taking teams. You just need 4 friends to play TTS, and you can play bad lists with the rest of us and have a bunch of laughs. And another thing I'm a big fan of, if you're in communities that can't meet yet, is remember why you got into Song of Ice and Fire, especially if this is your first war game and you love the IP. Do a screen share of, or one of those like simul streams of on HBO Go. Rewatch Game of Thrones, right? Just stop before the last season if that's what your real beef is, right? You probably love the first 5 seasons. Watch those and have a paint jam in Discord. Paint your figures. You can all pretty much pick a unit that's been spoiled already or something and be like, that's pretty good. I'm going to paint this while on Discord, having a pint or a coffee or whatever with my friends while I'm stuck at home. If you're up north, you're snowed in or whatever. And rewatch some of the shows and just talk trash about characters while you paint Littlefinger or whatever. That still builds community, and that gets people wanting to put that newly painted unit on the table, whether it's good or bad in 1.7, because it's painted. And we all know how hard it is to get through your painting backlog. The other thing, if you're a competitive store and your meta thrives on competition, I promise you right now, while I do advise what Brett said to take it to heart, that mixing 1.6 and 1.7 for the most part is a very bad idea. However, I will say play with the new terrain rules, even if you're playing 1.6 game modes, because the new terrain keyword changes and the new terrain rules, the way those abilities are worded and what has what, really, really matters to how your lists play in space on the table. Because a lot of factions right now don't have answers for auto disorderly going through hindering terrain. They just don't. And while we know we have reroll tech, and we're sure we're going to have some ignored terrain tech later on, the things that haven't been shown yet, it's a good way to practice what would happen if you didn't think to take that stuff, right? You can now decide, are you going to need it later when it gets revealed, or are you not? There's a lot to learn from playing with those keywords right now if you're a competitive player.
That's a great point. Not only your point about playing with the new terrain, because I haven't even began to really look into what kind of changes are coming, but I know it's going to be huge. But to your point of, like rewatching the show, that's something I've been doing while I'm painting miniatures. It's a reminder of why I started playing the game in the first place. I'm a collector, so I have everything. It's a great time right now to start painting stuff. If you have unpainted miniatures, just because you're waiting for the changes to come out, or you're waiting for your game store to start opening things back up for you to play there again, this is the time to do it. Another thing that you brought up, the tournament that I'm running. It's called the Slaughterhouse Rules. I'll get into more details about it next episode, because we're going to dive hard into what I'm planning for that. And we're going to build a couple of lists that you may see being played in the tournament. It's a TTS only tournament. It's international players, but it's also a team tournament. So we have room for one more team. If anyone is interested in playing in that tournament, message me on Facebook or on Discord. We have 9 teams so far, which is great. There's quite a few teams that actually were interested in playing it, because it's not a meta tournament. We have a few French teams that were like, we're sick of the meta. They really like the rules that I implemented for this tournament. Again, I'll go over all the details next week. So Max, do you have any last shout outs before we shut this thing down?
Nothing extra I can think of that we didn't touch on either earlier in the show or last week. Obviously, if any of you guys are anywhere near Northeast Ohio, we all game out of Gamers Haven in Parma Heights, Ohio. And as Chris has mentioned before, my dad does own that store. So any support that you can give is great. He's old, so the idea of him shipping stuff out is very challenging. But we appreciate any of the support that you could possibly give. He instantly marks stuff down below retail, so you are getting a discount too if you shop with him. So yeah, Gamers Haven.
Awesome. And then Charles, any shout outs?
Yeah, big shout out to Brett. I mean, as far as like beta testers and anybody who plays the game at top level but also has interaction with CMON, he is far and wide one of the greatest or most prolific content contributors in the meta, as well as showing up on tournament day and filling in a slot. He helped a big push for the North American World Cup to get people to play. He's played in a lot of these narrative side events and ELO events and things like that. And honestly, North American events and some of these other events wouldn't even fire if Brett didn't take the time to play this game as often as he does, even with the kid and work and everything else and the pandemic. He has made a ton of time for this game and to jam games with us, and has been a huge part of me getting up to competitive speed with his content and our free practice games as well as other stuff. So Brett's my big shout out.
Big shout outs to my patrons. I'll list them off right now. We got Matthew Austin, who I believe was recently deployed, so good luck on your deployment. We have Dave Meckler, host of Small Council Radio, Brent Russell, Greg Visaco, Lord Randall Murray, Linus Sir Tubbs, Steve Hamill, Tim Hahn, Josh Carson, Charles, my co-host, Ben Lynn of Blitz Minis, Stephen Newhouse Jr., Max, and my newest patron, Eric Ellis. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. I hope this was entertaining for you guys. Stay tuned for the next episode. We'll go over my tournament that I'm running in the next few weeks. And Charles, what's that saying that you always say?
When in doubt, no matter what rule set you're playing, just roll better. You'll win every time. Never fail panics, never fail charges. It's real hard to lose.
All right, guys, take that to heart, and we're signing off. Thank you so much.